Okay. Hello, everybody. We are excited to see everybody join us today. Welcome to our annual Teaching and Learning Conference for College Education. My name is Agnes Leslie, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this conference. This is the fourth year that we are having these series of conferences focused on repositioning Africa's place in the classroom. This conference is organized by the Centers for African Studies at the University of Florida, Boston, Harvard, Howard, and Indiana universities. Today's conference is on repositioning Africa's place in the classroom with a focus on knowledge, communication, and innovation. The objective of our annual conference is to rethink, reflect, and re examine how we teach about Africa and intentionally engage our students in transformative ways. This year's conference highlights the importance of creative knowledge production, the use of alternative media to speak back to dominant perspectives, inventive ways to rewrite Africa's rich history of freedom and resistance, the role of African universities in advancing innovation, and the creative contributions of African youth in reshaping the world. It is our hope that these presentations will contribute to reshaping and repositioning Africa's place in the classroom. In this regard, we have four informative and creative sessions, two in the morning and two in the afternoon, with 1 hour break for lunch. We are grateful to our presenters, Will Shoki, Bob Wekesa, Leslie Young, and Martha Saavedra for their presentations today. But before we begin the presentations, we would like to briefly introduce our centers. I am the Outreach Director for the Center for African Studies at the University of Florida, which is showing now. Our outreach program includes a variety of activities to promote and improve the teaching of Africa in K through 12 schools, colleges, universities, and the community. The Center for African Studies organizes teacher training institutes for K through 12 schools, colleges, and universities. We also publish Teach Africa, Taking Africa to the Classroom. We have lots of resources which can be accessed on our website, including the peer-reviewed African Studies Quarterly, which is open access. Please check out our website for more information. I will now turn to my colleague, Dr. Elsa Vieje of Boston University, to introduce the Boston University Center for African Studies. Elsa, please take it up.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Elsa, as Agnes has introduced me, and I lead the Boston University African Studies Center K-16 Education Outreach Program. And I cannot reiterate enough my enthusiasm to see you all here because it really means that you are committed to bring Africa-related content to your students. And in a context where even the word diversity is threatened, continuing to engage seriously with global studies, with African studies, is the only way that will ensure our students are able to engage in the world as global citizens. So the Boston University African Studies Center Education Outreach Program, just like the University of Florida Center for African Studies Outreach Program, has historically been a Title VI funded national resource center. And our main mission is to help instructors and teachers and support the inclusion of Africa-related content, African studies in every classroom, including in higher education. And we've done this in a number of ways. We organize events such as this one. We also, every fall, together collaboratively with the institutions present here, do a teachers workshop as part of the African Studies Association annual conference. We offer many online teaching resources, and I'll give you an example in the chat box right now. This is an example of ways you can start to bring Africa-related classroom There's a number of short articles that you can assign to your students here, including one that has the same title as this conference, Repositioning Africa's Place in the Classroom. Another really useful resource is our How Big is Africa poster. Some of you may know it already. It's a stunning visual to show the immensity of Africa, and it is a great entry point for multiple disciplines to talk about, well, if it's this immense, what does this mean in terms of Africa's diversities? I want to also highlight our African Studies library. Our library, because we are have been oriented to supporting the public, our library is also a great resource, and we have 3 full-time librarians who would be happy to consult with you on finding resources, and that we also have a number of open access guides, which you can see on that page. And finally, if you are in the Boston area, we welcome your visit anytime. We welcome your students' visit, and there are a number of great resources that you can borrow from us in our Teaching Africa library. So on top of having a full-time staffed African Studies library, we have a lending library for instructors. So you're welcome to come and visit and bring your students. So don't hesitate to email us. I'm plopping the email right now in the chat box if you have any questions and want to follow up. And I'll now turn it over to my colleague Lindsay at Harvard.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay, Student Support and Outreach Officer at the Harvard University Center for African Studies. And today I'm going to share with you our ASA Outreach Council website. All of us are members of the African Studies Association Outreach Council, and Harvard leads the charge on hosting and managing the website, as well as the council's YouTube channel. As Elsa mentioned, we have 2 teachers workshops that we host every year. Our ASA Teachers Workshop, which we host typically in November and December in conjunction with the African Studies Association annual meeting. And then this workshop, which we host every year in June, Repositioning Africa's Place in the Classroom, which is geared more towards university educators. Also on this webpage, you can find links to all of the various African Studies centers that are a part of the council here in the United States. And we have a blog where we share recordings of past teaching, teachers workshops, and then we have teachers resources here and a list of our various professional development opportunities. As I said, we also have our ASA Outreach Council YouTube channel, which I welcome you to subscribe to. It's where we post all of the recordings for our annual workshops that we host. As far as Harvard goes, we do a number of things that are open to the public. All of our events are typically public events, whether they're in person or recorded. Our website, I forgot to put up here, just a moment, is africa.harvard.edu. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. But one of the main events that we have every Monday is our African Studies workshop that takes place during the fall and spring semester. So I welcome you to subscribe to our newsletter at our center, as well as the ASA Outreach Council, to get all of the information about our center's events and outreach programming. So now I'll pass it on to my colleague Vanessa at Howard University.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you with us here today. My name is Vanessa Oyugi. I'm the Co-Outreach Director at Howard University. And like my colleagues, we provide resources and programming to increase the understanding of African histories and cultures and also contemporary issues. And so if you could click on Outreach, one of our core initiatives is CABA. Scroll down some and it'll show up there too. CABA is housed at the Center for African Studies. It presents literary awards to authors and illustrators of outstanding books on Africa annually, and this has happened for 33 years now. And so each fall we co-host the awards program that brings the award winners from all over the world to celebrate at Howard University in Washington, D.C. So if you are ever in the area in the fall around October, please do join us. This fall, we recognize, you can see announcing the 2025 CABA winners right there, down there. Yes, down there. announcing the 2025 CABA winners. We have winners from Nigeria, from Ghana, Ethiopia, and from the US. So if you would like to get to know some of these authors, please do join us. You can go back to see we have other CABA initiatives, including the annual Read Africa program, where we give gift books. We have global read webinars that happen annually in February around Black History Month, and the Read Africa Aloud program. Now, if you gone to BookTube, we also publish BookTube. It's an Africana magazine for teachers and students. So far, we have published 2 issues, as you can see there, Trade and Scholarship in Medieval West Africa and Connecting Threads. And so these are basically articles by well-known African scholars, African studies scholars, for the K through 14 classroom. And we also have lots of activities towards the end for students. So for both for teachers and for students. Okay, just to mention real quick, if you go back some, we do have other resources. Yeah, outreach, click on K through 12 teaching resources. We have one of our core initiatives, which we do in collaboration with Boston University, is the Gold Road Interactive Map. And this highlights the medieval Sudanic empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And you can take some time. It's quite an extensive site, so please take some time to just browse it. We have lots of lesson plans, but it's an extensive site in itself. And we're currently actually working on animating some of the profiles of historical people of this time in order to create even more engaging and vibrant interface for your students. And then if you scroll down some more, I mean, there's lots more to browse here. You go to lesson plans a little lower down. Please do browse our lesson plans. One of our favorite teaching frameworks are our voices lessons. And this is where we create profiles or role plays as a way to get to know historical figures. So please do take some time to browse. The homepage itself has a newsletter that you can, if you go to Center for African Studies on the top left, I can also put my email in the chat. And then you browse down some, you can click on join the mailing list right there, and you will be in our list. So I look forward to seeing you at more of our events, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think this highlights the center's, our mission in terms of teaching K through 12, K through 16, and the community as well, how we are engaged every time in terms of our teaching. And we hope that you'll be able to visit our websites to be able to engage and get more information. But before we get to our first presenter, I would like to just mention a few things to actually help us manage this conference today. Please turn off, and to begin with, I'm very excited again to have all of you here, but please turn off your cameras and turn off your sound during the presentations so that we can focus completely on the presentations. We have 15 minutes at the end of each presentation. During the Q&A, we invite you to engage with the presenters. So we ask during that time that you turn on your cameras, raise your hand, and ask questions. You may, of course, as always, put your comments in the chat and questions as well and suggestions in the chat as well. So we thank you again for being here, and I will turn on the floor to my colleague again, Elsa Viehe, to introduce Will Shoki. Thanks again. Thanks, Elsa. Take it up, please.
Thank you, Agnes. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first presenter of the day, Will Shoki. When the team of organizers were planning this conference around the themes of knowledge and creativity, we began looking for key sources of knowledge production that could be used in higher education, that could also be used in high school classrooms, and could generally help the building of knowledge and analysis about the continent as a whole for everybody. And we realized that we had not yet spotlighted a wonderful, rich multimedia source that is Africa is a Country. And you'll learn more about the name from Will. I have been a longstanding reader of Africa is a Country, which arrives straight to my inbox. And it's one of my go-to resources for real incisive analysis on contemporary events, on culture, political economy, on history, on movements. And it also offers podcasts and some great videos too. So Will Shoki is the editor-in-chief and a writer at Africa is a Country. His writings also appear in outlets such as the New York Times, Jacobin magazine, and multiple other outlets. He is today joining us from Cape Town, and we are especially grateful to you, Will, because you are joining us with a newborn at home and taking time out of your paternity leave to be with us today. So it's an honor to have you here. We're really, really happy to hear from you. And as you get settled up, I want to remind everybody, as Agnes said, turn off your cameras during the presentation. It doesn't matter so much because we will only be sharing the screen very selectively during Will's presentation. However, during the Q&A, which we'll have some time at the end to do about between 20 to 25 minutes, we would love for you to turn your camera back on and have an opportunity to engage with Will. And if anything that our presenter is talking about speaks to you and you want to include a question in the chat box ahead of time as he's speaking, I know for myself that that matters because I have terrible memory. So just feel free to write your question and comment as it comes to you, and then we'll engage with them after Will is done speaking. So without further ado, welcome, Will. It's an honor to have you here and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Elsa. I should say that I, for one, do not mind if others have their cameras on. I'm perfectly happy with other faces to be directed away from mine because I feel as if I look disheveled and tired, owing to the last 4 weeks of being a father to a newborn. But I'm so happy to be here this afternoon my time, and I believe it's morning for most of you, and it's a real pleasure, and special thanks to the ASA Outreach Council and all of the various co-sponsors, which was great to hear about at the top for this event and organizing this important gathering, to Elsa, to Agnes, to Lindsay and Vanessa. I'm very happy to be here, and always happy to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the work that I do at Africa as a Country. As Elsa has already mentioned, my name is Will Shoki. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Africa as a Country, which, if you haven't heard about yet, is an online platform for opinion, analysis, and new writing on and from an African left and Pan-African perspective. And I am also a writer myself. And today I'm going to be talking to you about this project that I help coordinate and lead. It's a publication that's been around for more than 15 years now. And while the name might sound like a mistake, it's very much intentional. In fact, my favorite genre of mail that we get to our inbox without fail every single week, we get angry emails from well-intentioned people letting us know that our name is a horrible mistake, and how could we be so stereotypical and believe that Africa is a country, and we'll have you know that actually it's a continent of 54 countries. And we sort of smile amused and say, yeah, that's precisely the point. And we borrowed it from a famous satirical essay by the late Kenyan writer Binyavanga Wainaina, who once quipped in this famous 2006 essay that appeared in the magazine Granta, which actually, let me try and see if I can share a link to in the chat. If you haven't come across it yet, I do encourage all of you. Elsa, you are 2 steps ahead. Thank you so much. But if you haven't read it yet, I do encourage you to read it. It's a phenomenal essay, and it's kind of a touchstone for how we at Africa as a Country think about our mission. And, you know, it has this incredible opening where he says, if you want to write about Africa, always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in your title. And much later on, he has this turn of phrase, which is kind of the punchline of which the name of the website is born, where he says, in your text, treat Africa as if it were one country. So that tongue-in-cheek phrase became our title. It was and still is a way of calling out how the continent is so often misrepresented and homogenized in global media. But over time, our project has evolved. We're no longer just trying to talk back to the West as we were when we started. We're now more focused on thinking with each other as Africans across borders, generations, and ideological lines about Africa's present and future. And crucially, we're trying to do this in a way that feels intellectually rigorous, politically grounded, accessible, and emotionally honest. So in this session, I'll share a little bit about our editorial vision, the role we think alternative media plays, and how educators, like many of you in the room, might engage with what we publish in your classrooms and in your communities. And the part that I most look forward to, which I'm hoping to leave ample time for, is time for questions and conversations, because I have a lot to learn from all of you as well. So by way of giving a bit of background and history, Africa as a Country began in 2009 as a modest blog founded by Sean Jacobs, who we had hoped would be able to join us today, but he has other competing commitments. And Sean is a South African academic who is based in the United States. He has been there for some time. And at the time when he founded Africa as a Country, it was primarily a one-man operation. It was a blog back when blogging was still something that people did earnestly, and it focused on critiquing how Africa was being portrayed in the Western media, whether it was through lazy cliches, parachute journalism, or the familiar loop of famine, war, and safari. But over the years, the blog grew into a collective project, became a platform for critical voices from Africa and the diaspora to write about politics, culture, and society from inside out. Today, we operate as a fully fledged publication, multimedia publication with a team of regional editors across the continent, a network of contributors from Nigeria to Algeria to Kenya, and a dedicated readership that spans the globe. What sets us apart, I think, is our editorial ethos. We're not just a news outlet in the traditional sense. We don't really chase headlines. In fact, we don't care too much about headlines. We're more interested in creating a space for reflection and argument, where African writers can engage with difficult questions about power, identity, history, and the future. Some of our most powerful pieces are essays, not articles, meaning that they are personal, polemical, and intellectually ambitious. We publish work that sits at the intersection of the political and the cultural, from analyses of state violence and economic precarity to reflections on music, literature, sport, and the internet. And all of this is grounded in a left-wing Pan-African sensibility that's anti-elitist, but not dogmatic. We believe that rigorous radical thinking belongs in public, and that criticism, when done well, is itself a form of care and solidarity. So over time, we've moved from simply critiquing how the West sees Africa to building a platform where Africans can theorize their own condition. It's not just about anymore correcting misrepresentation, but it's about claiming space and about thinking across movements and geographies about how the world might be otherwise. This is something we're particularly preoccupied with, which is not just thinking about all of the ways in which how Africa is portrayed is wrong, but compelling and imploring Africans themselves to think about how the world in which we inhabit, where we do occupy a subordinate place, might be different. How do we, as this conference asks, how might we reposition Africa? Not for anyone else, but ourselves. So why does a platform like Africa as a Country need to exist? Why does alternative media like ours and many others still matter? Well, it starts with the basics, which is why we exist, and that is how Africa is covered. Even now, in 2025, it's still shaped by inherited assumptions and tied narrative formulas. Most mainstream outlets still operate through what we call the foreign correspondent gaze, a lens that parachutes in during crises, searches for spectacle, and departs without context. there's still this assumption that African stories are only relevant when they fit into a pattern of catastrophe or exceptionalism. Now, it's true that things have improved somewhat. We've moved on from the outright Afro-pessimism of the hopeless continent era. I don't know if you all remember, it's a pity, I should have prepared a little bit more for this, but I had a newborn to look after. But I think one of the kind of paradigmatic examples of this kind of representation was a 2000 cover from The Economist magazine that called Africa the hopeless continent. That's sort of the kind of coverage that I think epitomizes the way a lot of Western media think about the continent. But there's also the glossy optimism of Africa rising. So kind of almost a decade later, there was another Economist cover in 2011 talking about Africa rising, this place of a lot of vibrancy and activity and ascendancy and so on and so forth. And these kind of binary representations, either extreme pessimism, Africa is this hopeless place, the heart of darkness, or kind of overcorrected optimism, Africa is the future. The New York Times had this spread, I think, towards the end of last year, which spoke about how we're the youngest continent and this is, I don't mean to say this is not true, but sort of giving this extreme glossy finish to talk about how the fact that we are the youngest continent means that we're going to be propelled into a place of power and potential in the future, so on and so forth. Kind of this oversimplistic portrayal of what it means to be African in the 21st century. So what's missing from these kind of extreme portrayals, either overly optimistic or overly pessimistic, is a sense of Africa as a place where thinking happens, a place where people are not just reacting to global events, but shaping their own futures with all the contradictions and complexities that entails. Often, sympathetic coverage also can fall into traps. It might, for example, name colonialism or invoke the IMF, but often in a way that flattens history or reduces people's lives to footnotes in grand processes. What you rarely get is an account of how power itself operates on the ground, how ordinary people navigate it, resist it, or are themselves complicit in it. You rarely get stories where African subjects themselves are protagonists with agency, contradictions, and thought. I think what we get frustrated a lot by at Africa as a country, even with sympathetic coverage, is that often Africans are talked about and things happen to Africans, right? We're never really kind of protagonists in the narrative ourselves, making decisions, negotiating power, sort of fighting for alternative futures. There's always stuff that's happening to us. And coverage is about what are the consequences and repercussions of that? We're always sort of victims of historical circumstance, but never really agents of history. So that's the space that we're trying to occupy, somewhere between journalism and critique, between politics and imagination. We want to offer analysis that's rooted in solidarity, but not sentimentality. We want to challenge the idea that African publics are passive recipients of global forces. Africans shape global events as well. And we want to create a body of work that doesn't just respond to the headlines, but builds an archive of how people live, organize, and think, especially those on the margins. So yes, we are alternative media in the sense that we are small, independent, and self-directed. But more than that, we are trying to be an alternative way of seeing, not one that insists on complexity, on historical depth, and on intellectual seriousness. Not because these things are fancy, but because they are necessary. Necessary if we want to create a public culture that treats people, all people, as capable of thought, feeling, and transformation. So what do we actually publish, and how do we decide what's worth covering? Well, at Africa as a country, we're not chasing the news cycle, as I said earlier. We're not trying to be first. We're trying to be thoughtful. Our starting point is always, what are the ideas and experiences that help us better understand the world from Africa outward? One of our guiding lights is, I think there's this, it's a famous clip of the Senegalese filmmaker Ousmane Sembène being interviewed, and he sort of scoffs. I think the interviewer asks him a question about whether he cares about his films being watched in Europe and abroad, and he says, why should I care? Europe is not my center. I am my center, and we kind of have a similar sort of sentiment where we want to think from the continent outwards, not from the world inwards. So what are the questions that move us, challenge us, or irritate us enough that we need to write back? Our coverage spans a wide range of themes, from class and inequality to youth protests to the politics of culture. We've published pieces on everything from mining royalties in the DRC and how that's shaping the electric vehicles supply chain, to the political economy of Nollywood, to the aesthetics of queer liberation in Southern Africa. We don't separate the political from the cultural. We think that they are deeply entangled. We also, very critical for us, don't pretend to be neutral. Our work is rooted in a left tradition that we trace from numerous publications that have preceded us, whether it's transition or work in progress or staff writer or et cetera, et cetera. In fact, there's a great series that is on our website called Revolutionary Papers, which is kind of this history of anti-colonial publications. And we consider ourselves to belong to that tradition as well. I'm going to quickly pop a link in the chat just so you can check it out. That's the wrong link. Let me send you the right one. There we go. So we're not neutral, right? We're rooted in this left tradition, this anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, democratic, and Pan-Africanist tradition. But that doesn't mean that we follow a party line, right? We're not a house journal for a mass political organization. We're suspicious of easy answers and are committed to rigorous disagreement. We don't want to push a line. We're not dogmatic. We're not looking for a formula for how one should think about Africa and its place in the world. We want our contributors to be grounded in movements and communities, but also willing to think beyond them, which is a very difficult balance because it requires one to both be sensitive to immediate circumstance and how the vicissitudes of those immediate circumstances shape how people think and what they do. But at the same time, we want to expand the moral and political imagination to go beyond immediate circumstance, to imagine how things might be different and how they might be otherwise. So we've published a lot. I'm not going to kind of walk through what we published. The best way to familiarize yourself with that is to check our website, and not just our website, but our platform, our YouTube page, where, as Elsa was saying at the beginning, we publish long form video as well. Our podcast platform, which is available wherever you listen to your podcasts, our social media as well. And across our platform, you'll find work on Sudan, on Senegal, on Kenya, on, the Caribbean, on, the way we think about it. In fact, Africa as a country is now at a place where, honestly, we're not just concerned about Africa, we're concerned about the peripheries. And the peripheries exist anywhere and everywhere. You find the peripheries in cities as glamorous and wealthy as New York, and cities as, impoverished and subordinated as, many of the ones you find on the continent. And we view ourselves as having a sympathy and sensibility with the marginalized and the peripheralized across the world, but especially in the global south or in the third world, which is a term that we believe should not have gone out of fashion, because rather than just naming geographical space internationally, also names a political project that tries to go beyond power, an organization of states where there are different blocks of power. It's one that sort of pushes forward a vision of non-alignment, but I digress. And you'll see that on our platform, our contributors draw connections between everyday experience that people go through, wherever they may be, and broader political formations. Some write from inside protest movements, others reflect from outside, offering critique or context, but all of them are trying to think seriously about freedom, what it means, how it's practiced, and why it's so elusive. You know, freedom, I imagine, you know, especially American context, not to stereotype, has a kind of sort of diminished and belittled meaning, which simply means kind of choice and non-interference from the state. But we push an idea of freedom that's expansive, which is about how can you reclaim self-determination in a genuine sense in your everyday life and be free from the exercises of arbitrary power, whether it's from the state, whether it's from corporations, whether it's from repressive structures of whatever shape and form. And we believe that ideas shape action, and that the best writing, even when angry or urgent, is also imaginative. It doesn't just describe the world, it gestures towards something better. So who reads Africa as a country? Our core readership at present tends to be urban, English-speaking, and relatively well-educated, scare quotes, based in places like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, the United Kingdom, the United States, and across the diaspora. Increasingly, we have a strong Francophone and Lusophone readership, as we've been publishing original pieces in French and Spanish, and are trying to kind of branch out into indigenous African languages, Kiswahili, Wolof, isiZulu, etc. Many of our readers sit within the adjacent worlds of academia, journalism, civil society. They are researchers, graduate students, artists, NGO workers, policy thinkers, educators, people who engage with big questions and looking for analysis that speaks to their commitments. But we're also keenly aware of the limits of that ecosystem, how the conversation can become closed, professionalized, or overly theoretical. Africa as a country has always been interested in being adjacent to academia without being confined by it. Many of our writers are scholars or have academic training, but we try to cultivate a different voice, one that's rigorous but accessible, grounded but provocative. We want to break ideas out of their institutional silos and bring them into public life where they can do more than circulate in seminar rooms. And in that sense, we see ourselves as part of a broader intellectual tradition, one where political and cultural criticism belongs not just in journals and conferences, but in newspapers, cafes, WhatsApp groups, union meetings, classrooms. The kind of thing that we publish isn't just for experts. It's for anyone who wants to understand the world more clearly and act in it more justly. So yes, we are read by students and professors, but we're also read by community organizers in Nairobi, trade unionists in Johannesburg, by members of the diaspora in Berlin or Toronto. And increasingly, we see our work being used in activist trainings, reading groups, and educational spaces where the goal is not just understanding, but social transformation. That's the impact that we care about. Not just visibility, but resonance, not just reach, but depth. We want our writing to offer tools for thinking, for teaching, for organizing, and we want to take our readers seriously, to challenge them, provoke them, and invite them into deeper forms of engagement. So how can educators, like many of you in the room, use Africa as a country? One of the most gratifying things we've seen over the years is how AIAC has steadily made its way into classrooms, not just on the continent, but across the world. We've had educators, whether at universities or political educators, shop stewards at unions or community organizers and activists, etc., tell us that our essays have been regularly assigned to undergraduates in global studies or history seminars, to high schoolers, to shop stewards, etc. And we're always humbled and a bit amazed by how far our material travels. A big part of that is because everything we publish is freely accessible. We publish under a Creative Commons license, which means that anyone, teachers, students, librarians, activists, is welcome to reproduce or adapt our work for non-commercial use, so long as we're credited. So that means you can photocopy, you can reproduce, you can do whatever you want with it, as long as you just say at the bottom, originally appeared at Africa as a country. We don't believe in paywalls. We don't believe in blocking access. None of that. We want the work to circulate and for people to access it. Over the past 15 years, we've built a vast and growing archive, hundreds of essays, interviews, videos, and reflections that speak to a wide range of issues: decolonization, gender and sexuality, protest movements, debt, culture, migration, labor, arts, sport. Whatever your subject area, chances are that there's something in our archive that can help open up a conversation. But more than just being a resource to use, we also see ourselves, and this is important, especially I think for people in the room, as a space to contribute to. We welcome new writers, for whatever your background, educators, students, community members, etc. And we treat publishing as a collaborative process. In a way, we think of Africa as a country as a kind of informal writing school. We're always open to giving emerging voices a platform, and we work closely with contributors, especially younger or first-time writers, to shape their arguments, refine their voice, and help translate complex ideas into accessible public writing. In fact, over the years, we've worked semi-formally with a number of high schools and universities and unions and community organizations to do just that, to help students and scholars and activists to learn to write beyond whatever sphere of activity they're in, to reach broader publics without sacrificing new ones. That's something we care deeply about. So if you or your students ever want to pitch us, we would be delighted. Whether it's a field reflection, a critical essay, a cultural review, or something more experimental, we're always looking to expand the conversation. In short, we hope that Africa as a country can be useful to you, not just as a platform that you use as a resource to draw from, but also as a platform to engage with, a platform for you to disseminate the ideas that you care about, one that is open, collaborative, and committed to public intellectual life. So looking ahead, where is Africa as a country going? And this is, I'm going to start to sort of round off my remarks. Where do we go from here? Like many independent media projects, we're always balancing ambition with resources. But our vision for Africa as a country has remained steady, to be a leading platform for critical African thought, and to do that by deepening our regional presence, expanding our forms of storytelling, and continuing to take our audiences seriously. In the last few years, we've been fortunate to grow our editorial team, bringing in regional editors in Southern, East, and West Africa, as well as a Francophone regional editor. Each of them brings not just their own insight, but also expansive networks of writers, organizers, and cultural workers. That's allowed us to sharpen our coverage, deepen our analysis, and move beyond the South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya triangle that often dominates Anglophone discourse on the continent. We've also expanded our formats. We've launched new podcasts, short films, and video essays. Our first feature-length documentary, which is on the iniquities of the climate crisis on the continent, exploring how a just transition is being fought and negotiated in South Africa, Kenya, and North Africa, is nearing completion and should come out soon. And we're experimenting with print again. We're on the cusp. In fact, later this month, we're launching our first ever print edition that brings thematic clusters of our work in a more tactile archival form. The topic for this inaugural print edition is the mass protest decade on the continent. So we're looking at the last 15 years of protest movements on the continent, which occurred at the point in history with the most amount of protests ever recorded in human history. And we're trying to understand what happened, looking at Kenya and the end-financeable protests, the Sudanese revolution, the Arab uprisings in North Africa, Fees Must Fall and Rose Must Fall in South Africa, etc. So that should be available soon. So if you want to get a copy of that, do stay tuned on our website for more details on how. And the reason we're doing print, many people say to us, how can you be so daft? Why are you doing print in a moment when people's attention spans are shortening, et cetera, et cetera? And one of the things that we've learned at Africa as a country is that so-called long-form content isn't dead. In fact, some of our most widely read and impactful pieces, the ones that spark debate, get cited in classrooms and circulate in WhatsApp groups, are precisely the ones that take time, that build an argument, that trust the reader to stay with complexity. We reject the idea wholeheartedly that people only want sound bites. Our readers want substance, and we aim to give that to them. So looking ahead, the question that we're asking ourselves at Africa as a country isn't just how we grow, but why growth matters right now. And to be honest, it's because we're worried. We are worried about the rise of authoritarianism and reactionary politics, not just on the continent, but everywhere. We're worried about the decline of public trust, the erosion of civic culture, and the retreat into disinformation and digital noise. And we're worried about something even more fundamental. What Sarah O'Connor, I think at the end of last year, wrote in the Financial Times, she described it as the emergence of a post-literate society. She cites research showing that in many countries, including highly developed ones, Literacy levels are falling, even among university graduates. 30% of Americans, where most of you are, for instance, now read at a level you'd expect from a 10-year-old. And the problem isn't just the mechanics of reading, it's the capacity to grapple with ambiguity, distinguish fact from opinion, sit with complexity. In short, the basic equipment of democratic life. And so while everyone is rushing to make content shorter, snappier, more digestible, we are trying to do the opposite. We believe that people are still capable of reading deeply, thinking critically, and changing their minds. That's why we're investing in print, not just as nostalgia, but as resistance. It's political. A printed object asks something of you. It slows you down. It invites you to linger. It says, this matters. We want to cultivate that kind of attention, especially now in the face of algorithmic culture and AI-generated slop. Because what we're up against isn't just disinformation, it's the hollowing out of the capacity to care, to interpret, to argue meaningfully. And if we lose that, we lose the very terrain on which politics is fought. That's why the work you are doing, all of you in this room, as educators, is so essential. You're not just teaching content, you're teaching habits of mind. You're defending the possibility of thought itself and thought in community with others. At Africa as a country, we see ourselves as a small part of that struggle. We want to offer materials that help people think clearly and feel capaciously. We want to train writers who can make complex ideas legible without flattening them. And we want to build publics, not just audiences. So where are we going? Hopefully towards more solidarity, more depth, more risk, and more commitment to the very things that are under siege in contemporary society: truth, critique, imagination, and care. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about our work.
Will, thank you for leading us into thinking deeply about what is needed in our world today. As I mentioned, as I introduced you, I encourage everybody to write your questions in the chat box if that's what you prefer. But at this time, we would love for you to turn your cameras back on so that we are able to have a larger conversation. And if you are wanting to speak your question, raise your virtual hand and I will call on you and we'll try to tackle as many questions as possible within our available time. And as you ground yourself in your questions and your commentary for Will, I wanted to, Will, you said so much, so I'll get us started with one question. You said many things that I think speak to the work that we do in classrooms as well, centering Africa in the classroom, centering Africa, no longer talking back to the West, being emotionally honest and intellectually rigorous in our production of knowledge about Africa, and many, many other things. So I have two questions, one kind of theoretical grounding that will that I'd love for you to elaborate on, and a second one that's more practical. The first one, when you mentioned no longer talking back to the West, we are no longer talking back to the West. That is such a crucial lens and a framing. And I realized then also that when I spoke about the work of including Africa, I used the word inclusion, right? So, and it's a different paradigm, it's a different framing than actually centering Africa. And then you also mentioned the non-aligned movement, which may not be known by everybody in this group. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the work of no longer talking back to the West, of centering African knowledge in the larger perspective of the non-aligned movement and being non-aligned, and what that may mean to you. So that's my larger question, and then I'll follow up with the concrete one afterwards. And everybody else, please raise your hand to follow after me, and I'll call on you.
Should I answer your question first also, or
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are some great questions. To answer the first one, I think it's hard in practice to clarify and concretize, what exactly it means to refrain from talking back to the West. But I think it names a kind of a guardrails, if you will, in the sense that I think so much of, especially in our early years, so much of what we published was accounting for the numerous falsehoods, misrepresentations, stereotyping that would take place in Western media, on the one hand, but also, as you pointed out, also kind of advocating for the inclusion of Africa on the other hand. So to say, you know, whatever conversation is happening at the exclusion of Africa. And here's why Africa should be part of this conversation, no matter whatever the topic was. And I think it sort of just reached a point where we came to realize that to engage in that kind of corrective analysis was to nonetheless kind of reify the central pace of the West in shaping global political discourses, because it cared about what the West thought, right? It cared about the conversations that were happening in the West vis-a-vis the continent. And so we believe that African political and social life, by and large, is something that is, of course, shaped by the West, but it's shaped by the West simply because, you know, Africa exists in a global community and engages in that global community on matters of political economy, international affairs, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as if the West is irrelevant to the social and political lives of Africans, but at the level of everyday life, when people are thinking, you know, about basic questions of, you know, their social reproduction, you know, the West doesn't kind of really feature, you know, it's people who, if you're in Cape Town, where I am, for example, and there is an informal settlement or a community of slums and people like access to water, you know, your most immediate preoccupation and what's foremost in your mind is, you know, the confrontations you have with your local ward councillor to try and, you know, lobby them to provide you access to the state service, right? And sort of reasoning from the minutia of everyday life outward would sort of, I think, opened our minds to the ways in which one can talk about Africa that takes for granted that, of course, what happens in Africa matters. And it matters not because it needs the validation of the West to matter, but it matters because these are people's lives. And these lives have dignity, they have meaning, they have purpose, they have value. And people are invested every single day across the continent in fighting for better for themselves, whether that's in ways that are productive or ways that are destructive. Both of those cases are interesting. And I don't know if I've really answered your question, but it's sort of, yeah, it's cultivating the sensibility where it's not as if we don't talk about what happens in the West or how what happens in the West affects the continent. But we talk about that as simply one factor in a broader matrix of factors that shapes how people live and reproduce their lives here. It's obviously it's decisive, but you know the reasons it's decisive are often explained by other structural factors too, right? The makeup of global capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you start scrutinizing that, you see the entanglements between elites here and elites there, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an attempt to answer your first question, and then kind of, you know, to talk about the non-aligned movement. You know, very broadly speaking, it was this initiative that emerged in the mid 20th century that was an effort by a number of countries to cultivate a political position that was neither East nor West, so neither allied with the Soviet Union and China, who were the major communist powers at the time, nor allied with the United States and, you know, North Atlantic countries were the major sort of capitalist powers at the time. And it was primarily led by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Joseph Tito in the former Yugoslavia. And there were numerous sort of conferences where that sort of political tradition was concretized. And so, you know, when we talk about a non-aligned sensibility today, it's sort of harkening back to that way of seeing the world, which, you know, as multipolarity is something that shapes the balance of geopolitical powers, refuses to sort of pick a side, whether that side is, you know, China or the United States, and that defends self-determination in a genuine and true sense. You know, one of the flaws of, you know, we can get into this debate, but one of the limitations of the non-alignment of YOR is that it was largely kind of led by these big men, right? Nasser and Nkrumah, Tito, etc. And Africa as a country, and the people who write for us, you know, we try to kind of advocate for a sort of grassroots non-alignment, which is to say, you know, forget about rulers and what rulers are doing and what political classes are doing, and think about, you know, what ordinary people are doing and how the interests of a working class New Yorker and working class Burkinabe are aligned in ways that might surprise people. And, you know, what's important is sort of cultivating an international political system that is sensitive to the needs of ordinary people rather than the needs of elites.
Thank you, Will. I have a lot to say, but I want to turn it over to Soji, who's had their hand raised. So Soji, feel free to unmute and speak your question to Will. And I want to point you, Will, to a number of acclamations of your talk in the chat box, which we'll share with you later.
Thank you very much, Elsa. That was great. That was an awesome presentation. And I have a confession to make. I'm probably the last one on this platform that's hearing about Africa as a country for the first time. But I'm so glad in hearing about you. Last year, in October, I went to a conference in Ghana. That conference was organized by University of West Indies. And I presented a paper there on Pan-Africanism. And the title of that paper was that W.E.B. Du Bois will be turning in his grave right now. The reason why I'm bringing this up is when you say that we have finished talking to, I'm paraphrasing now, to the West, okay? And the whole idea for me is this. For more than 60 years now, you know, after independence, it's so obvious that whatever, if we're going to get anything substantial from the West, it's not because they're going to give it to us, it's because we're going to take it. And that's where Pan-Africanism comes in. For those of us who teach Africa in the classrooms, why is it that we have to teach Pan-Africanism as history? What is it that, why is it that we cannot take that mantle? Why is it that we are not doing that? When I say we, I'm talking about that triangle. I'm talking about Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. Why is it that nobody is talking or doing anything about reviving Pan-Africanism? I'm not sure. I don't know. Again, if that's one of the things that you know, cover in Africa is a country, and if not, you know, whatever illumination that you can give on this will be very helpful.
Thank you so much, Soji. Will, why don't you take the answer, and then we'll go to Lynette in the chat box. I want to alternate, and then Agnes and Asante.
Yeah, thank you, Soji. That's a great question, and I'd love to read that paper if it's public. And I agree with you. You know, you ask a very difficult question, which is, you know, why are we not reviving Pan-Africanism today? And I think, you know, part of answering that question would involve asking why did it fail to begin with, right? And, you know, there's so much one could say at that point, but I think, you know, part of the answer involves, I think, admitting the extent to which so much of those initiatives, once again, like I think with not the non-aligned movement as well, was primarily led by these sort of visionary statespeople who were operating in, I think, extremely difficult political and economic circumstances, who were trying to chart a vision of, world making, as Adam Getachew describes it, that exceeded what the international capital, colonial capital, was prepared to allow them to do. And so, when those visionary leaders were ostracized or marginalized, whether it's Nkrumah or Nyerere, these kind of movements faded with them. And part of what we're trying to amplify at Africa as a country, because we're not necessarily ourselves, let's say, actors in this, is that we're trying to show the ways in which a different kind of Pan-Africanism is starting to emerge very slowly. And it's not capital P Pan-Africanism of the 20th century, but it's lowercase p Pan-Africanism. And it's in the ways in which sort of grassroots movements, sort of led by ordinary people, whether it's students or unionists or, anti-extractivism activists, are making connections between what they're facing across countries, right? The ways in which it will, like, you'll see this in the print edition when it comes out, but the ways in which Gen Z protesters in Nairobi drew from South African protesters during Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, and the ways in which these kind of concrete connections in struggle, in political struggle, are being built, and that we think at Africa as a country and the people who contribute to us can be possibly furnished a basis for a revitalized Pan-Africanism. Obviously, I think that's going to take a long time, and it's a matter of how do you solidify those transnational solidarities and build a coherent project across the continent. And I think part of why it's hard to think about that is that, back, in the 20th century, the political leaders we had were sympathetic to egalitarian visions of social transformation. But today they're not sympathetic. There are some of the biggest neoliberals you'll find, right? Whether it's Bola Tinubu in Nigeria or Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa. These are not people who are advocating meaningfully. They might put out the rhetoric, but they're not advocating meaningfully for visions of social justice. And so we don't have the political leadership, but we have the grassroots energy. And it's the question of how do you marry the two? And we don't have the answer.
Thanks, Will. A question from Lynette with a comparison to African American liberation movements in the US that have taken a decentralized leadership approach, in which there have been strengths and weaknesses of that approach of African American liberation movements. Comparing it to African cultural systems, do African cultural systems lend themselves to a decentralized structure?
That's I don't know how to answer that question, I must admit. I'd feel kind of reticent about sort of painting African cultural systems with one brush, and would have to say that it's you'd have to look at specific cases and sort of investigate what choices people are making in those cases and why. That's I think honestly the most that I can say. I'd say what you see over the last 15 years with a lot of political mobilization in general, not just in the continent but internationally, is that it does tend to be sort of leaderless and decentralized and non-hierarchical and so on and so forth, and that has its advantages and it has its drawbacks. And I think movements are assessing that and trying to figure out what should happen next. But I think a lot of these things don't come fixed before people, but are choices made based off of individual circumstances and what people believe at that moment in time will be most advantageous to their cause.
Great. Thank you so much. Agnes.
Oh, thank you so much. This is a wonderful, wonderful presentation, Will. You really, I think, some of the words that you said, social transformation, challenging and provoking our students, for that. And informal writing school stand out for me as some of the things that we can take to the classroom. My questions are twofold on the practical side. What do you see are the challenges for centering? You talked about Pan-African centering within the continent. What do you see as the challenges for that? And the other question that I have is maybe a more practical thing is what are the challenges that may actually be, before your institution? How are you funded, for instance? And how does democracy come in to actually sometimes thwart what most people would like to do? I mean, like in this country, for instance, we see, that uh, information sources like your own are going to be really deeply affected by government cuts and things like that, which we feel completely ourselves. So what questions or what issues do you face for your own? And again, congratulations for the existence that you have had for so long.
Thank you so much, Agnes. To answer the first question, it's a very big question. What are the challenges to Pan-African centering? Yeah, I mean, this is Africa as a country could be read as a project that tries to answer that question, and our body of work, a sort of historical archive at the numerous answers that numerous people have preferred. I would say maybe if I had to pick one that sort of tries to be a catch-all for numerous things at once is to say that the erosion of an imaginative horizon is the main one, and that has its own kind of historical causes. But I would say something really changed for this continent when the Berlin Wall fell, because up until that point, sort of in various anti-colonial traditions and Pan-African traditions, the North Star for political movement and mobilization, at least as an idea, was the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union testified to the possibility of organizing society outside the dominant mode, which was, Western, capitalist, colonial, et cetera, and all of those trappings. And I would say sort of since then, I don't think we've recovered, in the sense that I don't think that there is a coherent continental-wide vision for social transformation. And I don't think that there are political actors committed enough to that vision, from the level of the state to the grassroots, to bring it into being. So, even though there are these kind of, multilateral bodies and initiatives that are, ostensibly are focused on trying to kind of, let's say, de-link African trade from international trade networks in the age of Trump's tariffs. There's lots of talk about fast tracking the African continental free trade area, for example, just to use that as one example. And that's supposedly supposed to be this sort of new Pan-African initiative that will encourage intra-continental trade. And that is good for not only economic growth, but also economic sovereignty, so that African states are less dependent on Western finance and investment. But even that, lots of countries, that's taken so long to come into fruition, in part because I think, African political leaders and elites don't believe in it, right? They're not interested in that. It's much more suitable to their interests to be embedded, let's say, in international finance, because that gives you access to capital from the IMF, which you can use for, whatever you want to use it for. So, this is a very it's a very difficult question you've asked, and I don't think I could give a satisfactory answer in this forum. But I would say that, you know, there's that vision for a genuine Pan-Africanist vision, that is backed by political leaders and grounded in grassroots political movements that just doesn't exist. And I think that's the biggest barrier. And I think, you know, Soji asked the question, which is, how do you build that again? And I'm really not, I don't know how you build that again. You know, I think there are efforts of ordinary people that harken back to that vision, but how do you translate that into something meaningful and at scale? I think that is the question.
Thanks so much, Will. We are shortly running out of time, so I would like to ask Asante and Chumani to briefly state your question, and then perhaps, Will, you can address them both very briefly, and then we're going to have to wrap up our session. So Asante, please unmute and ask your question briefly.
Thank you all for organizing this. Happy to see a lot of familiar faces. My question is really around skill building, and whether or not you all as faculty see skill building as a pathway to be able to kind of reposition Africa in the classroom. You all have a lot of research that I think is tied to the economic activity of the continent. I've done some work where we've, seen even just like the Shea process and how, like, looking at the humanity, like the real world, like kind of folks who are on the ground within those spaces, how that process has, sometimes been overlooked. But when it's focused on and aligned with, something like supply chain or engineering, there's funding that can be put behind it. I am curious, as educators, if you all have considered working with different departments to bring funding into Africana studies. I know it's typically the lower end of the funding ends up in Africana, but I've seen some success in those type of partnerships where you might have an engineering course or a business supply chain course that needs that research from like a humanitarian point of view, and can be incorporated into whether it be like lesson plans or just positioned in such a way that that funding becomes available. But
thank you, Asante. Thank you so much. And Chumani, if you can unmute yourself and speak very briefly, possibly in under 30 seconds. And it's great to see you back here. It's wonderful. You have been a presenter in this space. So 30 seconds, and then we'll give you about 1 minute, Will, to finish up.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Will, for the presentation. I'm just interested to ask you about the cost of organizing. I think sometimes I'm just scared of us romanticizing social movement and activism. And many people tend to think that, in fact, there's less cost at the level of individual, the leader, the organizer, the protester, right? And of course, those who end up writing about the social movement, you find that they themselves, in a way, they're elitist within our institutions. I was just interested on the cost at the level of individual. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chumani. Will, as briefly as you can, addressing both aspects questions.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. And Umani, it's nice to see you in the room as well. So to start with your question, look, I think you've pointed out a very sort of thorny issue that has sort of been a perennial kind of issue for political movements, and a contradiction. And I can't tell you, what the correct stance on that issue is. What I can say is that Africa as a country, we do not shy away from writing about those contradictions that you point out, and from grappling with them seriously and grappling them without resolution. I look forward to everyone getting a a copy of the special edition, but also just reading the material that's on our website. We publish stuff that advances the kind of critique that you're making, Umani, that's, also where people disagree with it. And I think that's, the way we see our mission is that we want to be a platform, and we want to be a platform for people to do with us what they want to, and whether that's to disagree with each other, to disagree with us, to disagree with me. I tell people often, I've published things that I've expressly disagreed with stuff that I've written about, and for us that's important because it's an exercise in cultivating comradely engagement and good faith disagreement for the movements that we care about, and for democratic life in general. So I'll say that. And then Asante, I think your question, I think, was pitched more to educators and in the US context, and I can't really answer to that, but it reminded me that I didn't answer Agnes's question, which is about, what are some of the challenges that we face as Africa as a country as far as funding is concerned. Look, we're a difficult project to fund. At the moment, we depend on the largesse of donors, which we resent. We're financed by open society foundations who've been incredibly generous and who don't push us to adopt any kind of editorial line, but it's unsustainable. And so part of why we want to expand into print is to have some slight revenue stream to let us try and do this for the long haul. But Africa as a country over the years has taken many shapes and identities and forms. Some have depended on resources, others haven't. The most important resource we have is a network of people that we're surrounded by, and that won't change. And so the project might get smaller in the future, but it'll always have its essence, which is some platform where people share ideas and debate ideas. And are we prepared for this world? We're frankly not. We're experiencing the repercussions of Trump 2.0, but it's not just Trump 2.0. For example, we got kicked off of Facebook because we published an article that was critical of the United Arab Emirates' role in supporting the Rapid Support Forces, right? We got kicked off of Facebook for that. So there's reactionary and repressive and authoritarian currents that are flowing not only in the metropole, but in other parts of the world as well. The only way we can survive it is by continuing to just do what we do unapologetically. And if it gets us in trouble, we'll find ways to get around it.
Will, thank you so much. Please join me in a round of applause for Will's presence here and everything you've shared with us today. I would like to ask you, Will, before we go on to the next presentation, to drop a link where people can sign up for Africa as a country in the chat box. So I think people want to keep in touch with Africa as a country, and it would be great to know the easiest way to do it. Thank you again so much for being here and for causing us to think, which is one of the goals of Africa as a country.